Hi, hello, welcome back to my place on the internet. My name's Amanda and I post a lot of lifestyle, writing, and spiritual videos. Today I'm going to be talking about how to publish poems in literary magazines and journals. And no worries if you are not a poet, but you are a writer of another genre. You can totally swap out anytime I say poems or poetry or poet. You can totally swap that out for your own genre if you need. I've gone over this in other videos before, so I'm going to be very brief. My credentials to do this video: I am a poetry editor. I also have my Masters of Fine Arts in Poetry, and I have been published myself in numerous literary magazines, journals, and publications. That all being said, let us jump straight into this video. I've been getting into blogging lately, and so I wrote a blog post on this topic, which is where I am reading my notes for this video right now. And I will link that down below in case you want to read that through, because I also have some links in that blog post. Number one, read, and then read more, and still more, and even more after that. When I say this, I also want to emphasize that you should be reading quality books over just a quantitative number. You shouldn't be trying to read as many books as you can, as much as the best books that you can. And what I mean by this is reading a diverse range of genres, types of books, authors, styles, formats. I think this is important for everyone. Don't just read one type of poetry. Read older poetry, contemporary poetry, different movements within poetry. Read fiction, memoirs, creative nonfiction, short stories. There's so many types of genres and beautiful, amazing books to read, and I think you can gain inspiration and insight from all of them, no matter the genre. This also applies to publications. When you first start submitting, you don't want to go in without the knowledge of what typical literary magazines will publish or what the norms are within the industry. So you're going to want to read a lot of different literary magazines, publications, journals, anthologies. Number two, workshop your poems. A poetry workshop is essentially where you bring a piece that you want feedback on, and you meet with a bunch of other poets, you submit your piece, you read their poems that they have submitted, and everyone gives feedback on each other's work. Essentially, it's just a critique in order to make your poem stronger. Workshops are not technically required for getting poetry published, and I've certainly had a handful of poems published without workshopping them first. But especially if you're starting out, I would highly, highly recommend finding a workshop. A lot of local libraries will host them. Sometimes local bookstores will host them. The ones I attend, I found through meetup.com mainly, and then through my school connections. So I think if you can find places and people who are doing workshops, definitely get your hands in there. There's so many workshop groups out there, and a lot of them are very welcoming to newbies. So don't feel shy, get your work in there. It gets easier the more you do it, and it will significantly help to improve your poems. Number three, research different publications and formulate goals. Really reflect on why you are trying to get into literary magazines. Maybe it's so that you can feel good enough or feel like you are successful as a writer, or maybe it's for career purposes. Whatever the reason is, try to be honest with yourself, as this will help you to identify which magazines might be a good fit. How to find literary publications and submission platforms. There's three main platforms that I personally use for this process. The first and my favorite is Chill Subs. Chill Subs is a website that has a lot of different filters, so you can filter by genre, whether they're open, whether they're themed, whether there is a fee to submit. And then there's also Submittable. This is one of the classics in the writing world. Duotrope is similar to Submittable in the way that it's structured. It also has a lot of great opportunities on there. I like to use all three platforms. I'll alternate between which ones I'll use. I would recommend going in and looking at all the filters and trying to get a better understanding of what you might want in terms of a home for your piece. One important note that many people do not realize is that previously published also includes posting a poem on social media, a blog, your own website, any public platform. So do be aware of that. If you do have a TikTok or Instagram or a blog where you're posting your poems, you might not be able to submit them to certain magazines. Once you've narrowed things down and you found a place that you want to submit, or multiple places even, make sure to read that specific publication or publications. This one tends to get skipped a lot, but getting published is not about submitting as much as possible. It's about submitting to the right places with the right poems. When you're blindly sending out work without knowing much about the vibes, the themes, common ideas, and typical requirements of a journal that you're submitting to, you're setting yourself up for unnecessary failure. Read at least a couple poems from the latest issue published by that publication, read their about page, and overall try to get a general sense of what they typically publish. This will help you decide when a publication is or isn't right for you, what poems you want to submit to this specific publication, and potentially even what poems you want to write later on if you're really vibing with the specific aesthetic or theme of a website. I promise it actually doesn't take that long when you commit to it, and it can increase your rate of acceptance substantially. Number 5, choose which poems to submit. So this is a hard part of the process and one that I haven't really seen many people fully articulate because it kind of depends on your own preferences. One thing I will say is that I strongly recommend that before you start this process, you organize all of your poetry. Me personally, I have 2 different documents that I use. I have one spreadsheet where I track every poem that I've ever written. And then for each poem, I also list out key ideas, themes, images, anything relevant for that poem that I might be able to Control F search for later on. I also write when I wrote that poem, I write when it gets published, and then I have a self-ranking tier system where I assign a number 1, 2, or 3 to each poem. And I kind of self-assign these to my poems to kind of decide which poems I think are my strongest. This is totally subjective, but it kind of helps me later on figure out if I want to submit to a higher ranked literary magazine like the New Yorker, I'm going to pick all of my 1 poems. And if I'm going to submit to a new emerging magazine that just opened its doors, I'm probably going to submit some 2 and 3s. You can totally organize your poems however makes sense to you, but this is just one example of a way to organize that would help later on when you're submitting your poems. And then I also have a Google document of every poem that I currently want to submit to literary magazines or am open to submitting to magazines. So every poem starts on a new page, and then I also have the titles of every poem formatted as headers, so I can very easily click the sidebar and see a list of all the titles at once, so I know what pieces I have that I am currently trying to submit and get published. Okay, so then talking about the actual choosing process, everyone does this differently. For me, the 2 main things it comes down to are fit and just vibes and intuition/gut. So like I mentioned, when categorizing for the organization systems you use, you're gonna wanna keep in mind what criteria might be helpful when I'm submitting. So for me, having all the keywords of a poem and having a tier system helps me decide which magazine each poem might be a good place to submit to. But sometimes you can also just trust your gut. So after I read more about a literary magazine, sometimes I can sense a general vibe and aesthetic of what they typically publish, and then I'll select my poems based on what I could see feeling cohesive based on what I've previously read. Choosing often comes down to a lot of trial and error. At first, you're not going to really know what to do, so you might just have to wing it a little bit. But overall, the more you do this, the easier it will become to choose what to submit. Number 6. Format your pieces according to the guidelines. This is such a big step that you should not skip in any capacity. The reason it's so important is because certain publications will completely reject a submission for no reason other than that it did not follow the formatting guidelines. Usually every literary magazine and publication has a list of guidelines on their website, which will tell you how they want your submission formatted. So sometimes that comes down to spacing, the font size, whether or not your name is on it or any identifying information is on your poems that you're submitting. For me, I use a basic template where I have a document called 3 poems, where I list 3 poems, each one starting a new page in 12-point font Times New Roman, no identifying information. Then I have one called 4 poems with 4 poems, same format. I have one called 5 poems with 5 poems, same format. So I use these bare bones templates, and then I can adjust certain things based on the formatting requirements. Overall, just make sure you're reading the guidelines thoroughly and adjusting your documents based on what the guidelines require. You'll also want to make sure you're keeping track of where you're submitting. One common thing that people do when they're submitting is they name the title of the submission with the names of the poems that they're submitting. So that if a poem is accepted, you can go search that poem, say in Submittable. You can search the title of that poem, find every other place that it was submitted, and then go back in and tell those publications that your poem is no longer available because it was just recently accepted. Number 7, writing a cover letter for submissions. There's so many great places that I've already talked about how to write a cover letter for literary submissions. Essentially, you'll want to make a template that is stored elsewhere that you can easily copy and paste and fill out depending on where you're submitting. You can also customize this and add information as needed. For example, a lot of literary publications seem to love when you've mentioned a specific piece that you really enjoyed from their previous issue, where you make it somehow personable to that magazine themselves. The bare bones template that I use says, "Dear XXX," which is later filled out with the publication name. "My name is Amanda Conover and I have attached X unpublished poems for your consideration." And of course I'll update that with the number of poems that I'm submitting. Here is a brief third-person bio. I paste a bio. You'll want to keep your bio short and sweet and in third person. And then after my bio, I say, "Thank you for considering my poetry. I appreciate any time and attention my submission may receive and look forward to hearing back. Sincerely, Amanda Conover." It can be as simple as that, or you can also add some details to make it personable. Feel free to add a little flavor or personality of yourself in this cover letter while also keeping somewhat of a standard format. 8. How to deal with rejections. Rejection in any capacity is not always easy, especially when it makes you feel like you're not good enough or successful or worthy as a writer. The good news is it's normal to feel hurt, frustrated, disappointed, even angry when you get rejections, especially when it feels that you've gotten multiple and that's all you're getting. The other good news is it eventually will get so much easier to deal with rejections. At least it did for me now that I'm over 7 years into my writing practice. As a poetry editor, I can confidently state that some of the most stunning, gorgeous, breathtaking poems that have come into my submission queue, we have had to reject. And it had nothing to do with the quality of the work in any capacity. In some instances, we had already elected to accept other pieces on similar themes and topics, and we didn't want our issue to be overcrowded with one particular idea. Other times, the content of a poem was just too dark for what we would typically publish, and it would stand out among other pieces in our issue. Knowing this might not fully erase the sting of a rejection, but remember that great poems often get rejected, and some of your favorite poems and poets faced multiple rejections before getting one acceptance. One interesting strategy that I've seen people do in order to cope with rejections is to keep track of all of them as if they're a celebration. I even had a professor once who printed out his first 100 rejections and hung them up on his wall as a reminder that trying at all is a celebration. Bonus tips. Don't worry about quantity as much as quality. It's common advice in the writing world to say it's a numbers game in reference to submissions, but there's no point in getting a poem published someplace where you're not proud for it to be. Not every magazine is somewhere that you'll want your work to be, so it's worth taking the time to think things through and consider where you're submitting. Watch out for bad actors. While the literary community as a whole is an amazing place, there are some journals that are scammy, predatory, and just not the best. For example, it's not normal or right to be accepted into a print publication and then not be given a free contributor's copy. Journals who are unresponsive, who make edits to your piece without running them by you before it's published, and who aren't transparent about the timeline and publication process are ones to be wary of. Maybe you still decide to submit there, but it's definitely best to proceed with caution and trust your gut when you feel that something is off. Always submit the max number of poems allowed. By this, I mean submission calls that ask for a maximum of 5 poems. If the max is 5, submit 5, because why not? If you've done all your research, this only increases your chances. The only exception that I found to this is themed calls. If you only have 1 piece or 2 pieces that match that particular theme, it's okay not to hit the max in those instances. That's everything for my video. I did elaborate in some instances in my blog post, so I will have that link down below in case anyone is interested. Thank you for making it to the end of my video. I appreciate you all so much, and with that being said, I will see you next time. Peace out. Let me get out my handy dandy laptop. Look how pretty she is. Oh, wait, this is actually backwards. Look how pretty she is. Workshops are not essentially, wait. For example, it's not normal or right